In 1858, while two nations were sharpening their bayonets over a question that sounds almost theological, who among us actually has a soul, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur was bent over a flask of fermenting grape juice, and he was about to stumble onto an answer that could have changed everything. Today, we are pulling apart Pasteur's life and research through a genuinely unsettling academic thesis, one that argues every time humanity crosses what the author calls an epiphanic threshold, a moment of paradigm-shifting discovery, the resulting intellectual dissonance doesn't just cause debate, it causes social upheaval. And each time, the upheaval gets worse. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what spontaneous generation actually was and why serious scientists believed it, how Pasteur's fermentation work connects to a much darker chain of historical consequences, and what the author means by intellectual idolatry as the fatal flaw inside accredited academia. I've got someone here who has been deep in this material, and I want to start with the big picture.
So the author's framework is this. Human history, when you trace it through the history of science, moves in a series of what he calls epiphanic thresholds. These are moments when a discovery is so paradigm-shifting that it creates genuine cognitive dissonance among the intelligentsia. And the argument is that this dissonance doesn't stay in the ivory tower, it spills out into society and produces upheaval and attending human rights violations. What makes the thesis genuinely alarming is the ratcheting mechanism he describes. Each threshold doesn't just cause its own chaos, it prefaces the next one, and the consequences of each epiphany grow worse.
So it's not just that each discovery is disruptive on its own, it's that they compound.
Exactly. And the author traces this entire arc from a single invention, the optical lens. He starts with Ibn Sal's lens, moves through Galileo's telescope, then Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and from there, the descent, as he puts it, was precipitous. Malthus, Darwin, and then Louis Pasteur all tumble into the rabbit hole opened by that one piece of glass.
That is a wild chain of causality. One lens, and eventually you end up at the Holocaust.
That is precisely the author's thesis. And he is careful to say he is not blaming the scientists. He is diagnosing a consistent failure within accredited academia to maintain the integrity of peer review. The problem, as he frames it, is that hypothesis gets presented to the general public as settled science instead of remaining what it actually is, mere hypothesis.
Right, and that distinction matters enormously. So let's ground this in Pasteur specifically. What is he actually doing in 1858, and what is the intellectual landscape he is walking into?
So in 1858, Pasteur begins experimenting on the causes of fermentation in the French alcoholic beverage industry. And the author is very precise about the timing here. At that exact moment, Charles Darwin is documenting his theory on the origins of species, in tandem with Alfred Russel Wallace. But here is the key detail. Nobody had yet posed a hypothesis for the origins of life itself. That question was still wide open.
And the dominant theory at the time was spontaneous generation.
Right, and the author has a very specific and actually quite generous take on spontaneous generation that I think most people would not expect. He calls it theology wrapped in scientific mumbo-jumbo, which is a great phrase. But then he immediately says, and this is the surprising part, it is a shame that it has been so thoroughly discredited because even if there is no creator, spontaneous generation is all that could plausibly account for the manifestation of the first life form.
Wait, hold on. He is defending spontaneous generation? Not defending it exactly. He is pointing out that the alternatives are not actually better. Think about it. Today, evolutionary biologists trying to explain the origin of the first life form describe ambient environments favorable to life. The atmosphere, a tidal pool, geothermal springs, seabed steam vents. But all of those are just different versions of the same basic claim. Life emerged from non-living chemistry under the right conditions, which is, structurally, spontaneous generation.
So we just gave it a more sophisticated wardrobe.
That is a very good way to put it. And the author goes further. He says the only alternative to spontaneous generation is that life was introduced to our planet from an external source, an asteroid, aliens, whatever. But then he asks the obvious question, where did they get the life they delivered? You cannot avoid the question by imagining the answer is out there somewhere.
It is just kicking the can down the road cosmically. Exactly. And so the author lands on this remarkable formulation. He argues that the laws governing the physical world are arrayed in what he calls an order of precedence. Quantum physics determines atomic physics, Atomic physics determines molecular physics determines chemistry determines fluid dynamics determines microbiology. And in that hierarchical cascade, life is not an accident. Life is an inevitability.
So life is implicit in the laws of the universe until it becomes explicit on a life-bearing planet.
That is almost verbatim from the text, yes. And he draws a fascinating parallel to Hindu cosmogony, where the creator is described as the eternal cause of all causes, and the mandala is interpreted as an illustration of cascading domains of physical existence emanating from that center. He also references the verse of light from the Quran, Surah 24:35, as another ancient attempt to describe these nested domains of material existence.
That is a genuinely unexpected move in what is ostensibly a history of science argument.
It is, and it tells you something about the author's project. He is not trying to adjudicate between religion and science. He is trying to show that the conflict between them is itself the problem, the source of the dissonance that produces the upheaval he is charting.
Okay, so bring us back to Pasteur in 1858. He is in the middle of this enormous unresolved debate about the origins of life, and he is looking at grape juice.
Right. And what he discovers is that microbial forms of life are responsible for turning grape juice into wine or vinegar. Other forms of microbial life, he later confirms, are responsible for turning milk into cheese or spoiling it completely. The author describes these as diseases of wine and diseases of milk. And Pasteur openly postulates, though he never proves it at this stage, that microbes may also be causing diseases in humans.
Which sounds obvious to us now, but in 1858, that is a genuinely radical claim.
Radical and consequential in ways Pasteur himself could not have foreseen. The author makes this striking observation. In 1858, Pasteur was so close to proving that microbial life caused diseases in humans that tens of thousands of soldiers could have been saved in a civil war fought over the origins of species.
Wait, a civil war fought over the origins of species. That is not how any textbook I have ever read describes the American Civil War.
And that is precisely the author's point. He is very direct about this. He says, though no high school textbook admits the fact, the leading scholars of universities in the rebellious South had gotten their hands on Darwin's Origins of Species and Karl Marx's The German Ideology, and the two, in combination with each other, were deadly.
How so? Walk me through that combination.
So the argument is this. Newly forged atheists at rebel universities began using Darwinian evolutionary biology to argue that Africans were a subspecies of hominid. And then they layered Marxist social theory on top of that to argue that slavery was actually the scientific optimal, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Slaves, they claimed, were provided everything they needed, while unemployed northern workers died of starvation.
That is a genuinely horrifying intellectual move, using the language of scientific progress to justify human bondage.
And the author is unsparing about it. He says the Civil War was the first socialist revolution in world history, and we narrowly defeated it. The battle lines in the ivory tower, as he puts it, were not just being drawn in 1858, they were being redrawn. Agnostics in southern universities were leaping headlong into atheism, and classical scholars were retreating into theology.
So the Civil War, in this framing, is not primarily about slavery or states' rights. It is about who does and does not have a soul.
That is exactly how the author frames it. And the tragedy embedded in that framing is that Pasteur, at that very moment, was on the verge of proving that diseases were not punishments from God, but biological consequences of pathogens. If that proof had arrived a decade earlier, the entire intellectual architecture supporting the Confederacy's pseudo-scientific justification for slavery might have collapsed before the first shot was fired. Because the proof that disease is microbial, not divine, would have undermined the idea that God was sorting the worthy from the unworthy through illness and suffering. Precisely. And the author marks 1905 as the definitive turning point. By then, the proof that diseases were not punishments from God but biological consequences of pathogens was established. And he says, at that juncture, the divorce between religion and science became final. There was no way to stop what was coming.
Which brings us to the Café Central in Vienna in 1910.
Yes. And this is where the author's thesis reaches its most dramatic point. He describes traveling, metaphorically, to the Café Central in Vienna in 1910, where Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and Dmitry Mitrinovich, as well as Vladimir Lenin in absentia, were meeting. And in a thick cloud of opium smoke, as he puts it, this clique of chin-scratchers evolved into what he calls the proletariat, the first and only species of hominid in history to be defined by science. Except, he says, it wasn't science. It was insanity.
And on the periphery of that coffee clutch was a loner named Adolf,
soaking it all in from a table across the room and making plans of his own. All of this, the author insists, from the consequences of Ibn Sal's lens.
That is a staggering chain of causality to lay out. And I want to push on it a little because someone listening might say, isn't this just the great man theory of history in reverse? Instead of crediting one genius for everything good, you are blaming one lens for everything catastrophic.
That is a fair challenge, and I think the author anticipates it. His answer is that he is not blaming the discoveries themselves. He is diagnosing the institutional failure that surrounds them. The lens, the telescope, the microscope, these are not the problem. The problem is what happens inside accredited academia when a discovery is so disruptive that it shatters the existing paradigm. The dissonance that follows is where the danger lives.
And that is where his concept of intellectual idolatry comes in.
Right. And this is, I think, the most philosophically interesting part of the thesis.
He defines intellectual idolatry very precisely. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than they are to manifest truth, that is a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that is also a form of idolatry. And then he says something that I find genuinely striking. Since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we are all susceptible to it. We believe what we believe for reasons we are convinced are justifiable. And when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we are hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves by what we believe.
Exactly. And the author's diagnosis is that failures in peer review cannot fully explain the dissonance at epiphanic moments. Idolatry is the only diagnosis that explains it, because peer review is a mechanism. It can be fixed or improved. But idolatry is a human condition. It requires something much harder, genuine intellectual humility.
And he argues that what every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces is that we are our own worst counsel.
Yes. And accepting that, he says, is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome. But it must be done.
Let me ask you something that I keep circling back to. Pasteur himself, was he guilty of intellectual idolatry? Or does he represent something different in this framework?
That is a really interesting question, and the author does not directly answer it. But I think the implication is that Pasteur represents the genuine article, a scientist following empirical method. The author distinguishes between the few who were following empirical method and the many who published pseudoscience in what he calls an orgy of intellectual ambition. Pasteur seems to fall in the first category.
So, Pasteur does the real work. He crosses the threshold legitimately. But the threshold itself, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, and the consequences ripple outward in ways he has no control over.
That is a very clean way to put it. And the author even uses a phrase that I think captures this perfectly. He says, there will always be a Louis Pasteur, meaning there will always be someone doing genuine, rigorous, world-changing work. The problem is not the Pasteurs. The problem is what the intellectual culture does with what the Pasteur discover.
There will always be a Louis Pasteur. That is a haunting line.
It is, because it is simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because genuine inquiry never stops. Terrifying because the dissonance it produces never stops either.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the tangent about the Café Central, because there is something almost cinematic about that image. The future architects of the 20th century's worst atrocities, sitting in a Viennese coffee house, and a young Adolf at a table in the corner. And the author is saying all of this traces back to a lens.
And specifically to the failure of the institutions that were supposed to manage what the lens revealed. The author's argument is not fatalistic. He is not saying the Holocaust was inevitable because of physics. He is saying it was made nearly inevitable by a consistent, repeating failure of accredited academia to distinguish between hypothesis and established science, and to maintain the integrity of peer review.
Which is a very different kind of indictment. It is not blaming the scientists, it is blaming the system that was supposed to hold them accountable.
Exactly. And the system failed not because it was corrupt in the ordinary sense, but because the people inside it were human. They were susceptible to idolatry. They were more devoted to their paradigms than to manifest truth. And when a Pasteur came along and shattered the paradigm, the response was not always honest inquiry. Sometimes it was entrenchment. Sometimes it was the weaponization of the new knowledge.
And the weaponization of germ theory, of evolutionary biology, of social Darwinism, that is the through line from Pasteur's flask of grape juice to the 20th century's worst catastrophes.
The author would say yes, and he is careful to note that the righteous were fighting back almost from the beginning. He cites James Oglethorpe's plan for the American colonies as an early example of people trying to slow the descent. He credits the Union victory in the Civil War as the world's first war against pseudoscience. He credits Ulysses S. Grant's creation of the public education system as an attempt to stop it in its tracks. But to no avail, he says. The march toward the Holocaust continued.
And Mary Baker Eddy gets a mention too, right? As someone who tried to reframe religion as a scientific process.
Yes. The author describes her as sensing academia's encroachment on religious paradigms of investigation and attempting to reframe religion, and specifically prayer, as a scientific process. It is a fascinating detail because it shows that the response to the widening schism between religion and science was not just retreat. Some people tried to bridge it. But by 1905, with the proof that diseases were biological consequences of pathogens rather than divine punishment, the divorce was final.
And from 1905 forward, science would reign supreme among the world's intelligentsia. But the few following empirical method were outpaced by those publishing pseudoscience.
In an orgy of intellectual ambition, as the author puts it, which is a phrase that should probably be on a warning label somewhere.
It really should. Okay, I want to make sure we give the spontaneous generation piece its full due, because I think it is the most philosophically rich part of this whole discussion, and it is easy to skip past it. The author is essentially saying that Pasteur demolished a theory that, in its deep structure, remains the only honest answer to the hardest question in science. Right. And the author is not being contrarian for its own sake. He is pointing out a genuine logical problem. If you remove a creator from the equation, you must accept that life formed as a direct result of chemical, mechanical, and energy work performed at some nexus. And that implies, he says it nearly guarantees, that life itself is an inevitability found within the laws of chemistry, mechanics, and physics, which means life is not a miracle in the sense of being outside the laws of nature. It is a miracle in the sense of being the inevitable expression of those laws. Life is implicit in every law governing the universe until it becomes explicit on a life-bearing planet.
And he notes that the earliest forms of life were chemosynthetic, not photosynthetic. The Earth's atmosphere did not allow enough sunlight to penetrate to the surface to permit photosynthesis until well after life had manifested. So the law of superposition, as he puts it, is inviolable. You cannot have photosynthesis until you have sunlight. The first life forms had to be chemosynthetic, which points, he argues, towards seabed steam vents as the most plausible cradle of life.
And he notes that geologists, not biologists, have confirmed that life forms can and do manifest in the most unfathomable depths of the earth.
Yes. And then he makes this wonderful provocation to his colleagues in the biology department. He tells them to read Genesis, because a verbatim reading of Genesis, he says, is actually consistent with geology as the cradle of life. The earth brought forth life. The ocean brought forth life. No evolutionary biologist, he argues, can claim they were the first to identify geology as the cradle of life if they have actually read the text.
That is a move that will annoy everyone equally, which is probably the sign of a genuinely interesting argument.
He seems to be aware of that. He is not trying to convert anyone. He is trying to dissolve the false binary between religion and science that he sees as the engine of the dissonance he is charting.
So when you step back from everything we have covered today, Pasteur's fermentation work, the spontaneous generation debate, the Civil War as a war over the soul, the Café Central in Vienna, the ratcheting mechanism of epiphanic thresholds, what is the author actually asking us to do with all of this?
I think he is asking us to do something genuinely difficult. He is asking us to hold our beliefs more lightly, not to abandon them, but to be more devoted to manifest truth than to the interpretations and hypotheses we have built our identities around. Because the pattern he is charting is not a story about bad people doing bad things. It is a story about intelligent, credentialed, well-intentioned people who were more devoted to their paradigms than to the evidence in front of them. And the consequences were catastrophic.
And Pasteur sits at the hinge of that story. He is the genuine article, following empirical method, crossing a real threshold, doing work that saves lives. But the threshold he crosses cannot be uncrossed, and the world on the other side of it is not ready.
That is the tragedy the author is pointing at. And the warning he is issuing is not about the past, it is about right now. We are living inside epiphanic thresholds of our own, in artificial intelligence, in genomics, in cosmology. The question is whether the institutions of accredited academia have learned anything from the pattern he is charting, whether peer review will hold, whether intellectual humility will win out over intellectual idolatry.
And the author's honest answer seems to be, he is not sure.
He says he anticipates that accredited academia will soon come to an agreement on certain maxims of physics, but he is not convinced they will all agree on what those maxims ultimately mean. There will always be a Louis Pasteur, and there will always be a Café Central.
Here is what this really comes down to. In 1858, a man peering into a flask of fermenting grape juice was doing something that looks, from the outside, like the most mundane kind of science. But what he was actually doing was pulling a thread that would unravel the entire fabric of how humanity understood disease, divinity, and the origins of life itself. And the institutions that were supposed to manage that unraveling, to distinguish hypothesis from established truth, to maintain the integrity of peer review, to hold the line against intellectual idolatry, those institutions failed. Not because they were evil, because they were human.
And the author's point is that the failure was not random. It was structural. It was predictable. It was, in a sense, inevitable, given the nature of epiphanic thresholds, which means the only way to interrupt the pattern is to change the structure, to build institutions that are genuinely more devoted to manifest truth than to the paradigms they have inherited. That is a harder problem than any scientific discovery, but it is the problem the author is insisting we face. And the actionable insight here is not abstract, it is personal. The author says, we are all, in some measure, both theologian and scientist. We are all susceptible to idolatry. The question is whether we are willing to do the hardest thing, to be more devoted to truth than to the beliefs we use to define ourselves.
What every major religion instructs and what peer review of science enforces is that we are our own worst counsel. Accepting that is the most difficult challenge for any free-thinking individual to overcome, but it must be done. There will always be a Louis Pasteur. The question is whether there will always be a Café Central waiting on the other side of what he discovers. That is the question this thesis leaves us with, and it is not a comfortable one.